My name is Claire Vance. I'm 32. 2 days ago, my older sister sat across from me in a crowded restaurant, slid a forged power of attorney form across the table, and smiled while she told me my life savings of $65,200 was officially gone. I had spent 7 years saving that money to buy my first home, but she looked me dead in the eye and said she needed it more for her destination wedding in Italy. But here's what she didn't know: I'm a federal patent attorney. I spend 40 hours a week dissecting intellectual property theft, identifying fraudulent signatures, and freezing unauthorized assets. And I had already spent the last 24 hours building a legal cage she couldn't run from. Before I tell you how a lifetime of playing the quiet, dependable younger sister ended with me systematically dismantling my family's entire financial foundation, do me one favor. If stories where the person who always stays silent finally stands up and uses their professional training to exact quiet, undeniable justice are your kind of video, hit subscribe. Because what happened when the main course arrived at that restaurant, nobody in my family saw coming. To understand why my sister thought she could look at my bank account as her personal funding source, you have to understand the dynamic we grew up with. I was the girl who stayed in her room, memorizing legal case files and drinking cold coffee while studying for the bar exam. My sister, Chloe, was 35, 3 years older than me, and lived her life like the world owed her a permanent multi-million-dollar inheritance. She didn't have a career. She had business concepts that lasted 6 months before crashing into mountains of credit card debt. Our parents, Richard and Eleanor, treated her like a delicate glass sculpture that would shatter if anyone mentioned the word responsibility. I was just the background noise, the one who paid her own tuition, found her own apartment, and never asked for a dime. Growing up, my father always told me that family meant looking out for Chloe because she had an artistic soul that wasn't built for the harsh realities of corporate life. That was his polite way of saying Chloe refused to work a standard job. My mother went a step further, constantly reminding me that since I had a good income at a major intellectual property law firm, it was my job to make sure Chloe didn't feel left behind. I accepted it for years. I thought that by being the reliable one, I was earning their respect. I thought if I just kept my head down and proved my worth through my achievements, they would eventually see me as an equal. I was wrong. The pattern of betrayal started small, the way these things always do when a family decides one child is a golden idol and the other is just the maintenance crew. It began 5 years ago when Chloe decided she wanted to open an artisanal candle boutique. She needed a $5,000 cash injection for her initial inventory, and my mother called me crying, claiming Chloe was facing eviction because she had put all her rent money into her dream. I wrote the check. I didn't want my sister on the street. 2 weeks later, I saw pictures on social media of Chloe on a beach in Cabo San Lucas. When I confronted her about where the candle inventory was, she laughed, waved her hand, and said she needed a creative research trip first. When I looked at my mother for support, she just sighed and said, "Your sister never has these emergencies without a good reason, Claire." That was their favorite phrase. It became the shield they used to protect Chloe from the consequences of her own actions. Whenever I pointed out that Chloe was spending money she didn't have, or that she was manipulating our parents into draining their own modest retirement funds, my mother would look at me with a cold, dismissive expression. She would tell me that I was being bitter because Chloe had a vibrant social life, while I spent my weekends buried in patent applications and legal briefs. I started to believe them. I started to think that maybe I was just cynical. Maybe I didn't understand the deep, unconditional bond of sisterhood. So I kept my mouth shut, worked 60 hours a week, and focused on my career. My job as a patent attorney requires an obsessive attention to detail. Every single day, I review complex filings, verify legal definitions, and look for the tiny discrepancies that separate a legitimate invention from an intellectual property theft. I am trained to look at documents not for what they claim to be, but for what the legal reality behind them actually is. I can spot a forged authorization or an invalid corporate resolution from across a room. It's a highly technical, dry, and precise line of work. It requires a calm mind and an absolute refusal to let emotion cloud your judgment. Little did my family know, That exact training was turning me into the worst possible person to steal from. 2 years ago, the exploitation escalated from a small annoyance to a systematic drain. Chloe decided she was going to be an interior designer. She didn't go to school for it. She just printed out business cards and convinced my father to co-sign a $15,000 business loan for her studio space. Within 8 months, the business folded because she spent the loan on designer furniture for her own apartment instead of marketing or client acquisition. When the bank came calling for the monthly payments, my father couldn't cover them. His health was failing, and his pension was barely keeping up with his medical bills. My mother came to my office, sat in the leather chair across from my desk, and begged me to take over the loan payments so my father wouldn't go into default. I agreed, but only on one condition. I told my mother that Chloe needed to sign a formal promissory note agreeing to pay me back once she found stable employment. I drafted the document myself, using standard contractual language. When my mother took it to Chloe, Chloe refused to sign it. She threw a massive tantrum, calling me cold, calculating, and heartless. My father called me that night, his voice shaking from exhaustion, and said something that permanently shifted how I viewed my family. He told me that I was ruining the family peace over a piece of paper, and that real daughters don't keep receipts. That phrase, real daughters don't keep receipts, echoed in my mind for days. But my father's shaking voice wore me down, and I took over the $15,000 loan anyway, paying $450 every month directly from my paycheck to keep the bank off his back. Chloe never thanked me. In fact, she stopped speaking to me for 3 months, telling our cousins that I was trying to control her life with my corporate money. I watched from a distance as she transitioned into her next phase, which was dating a man named Julian who claimed to be a high-end luxury travel consultant, but didn't seem to have an office or any visible clients. The only person who saw through the entire facade was my maternal grandmother, Grandma Vivian. She was 84, a retired high school math teacher who still wore her silver hair in a sharp, elegant bob and never used a calculator to balance her checkbook. She lived in a small, immaculate house 2 miles from my apartment. Whenever the rest of the family started gaslighting me, telling me I was the cold one, I would go to Grandma Vivian's house. She would pour me a cup of black tea, sit across from me at her oak kitchen table, and tap her fountain pen against the wood. "Claire, a tiger doesn't change its stripes just because you feed it more meat," she told me during one of those quiet afternoons. "They're using your stability to fund her chaos. The moment you stop letting them bleed you dry, you will become the villain in their story anyway. You might as well protect yourself." She was the only one who validated my anger. She knew exactly what Chloe was doing, and she was the one who reminded me that my intelligence wasn't a flaw to be ashamed of, it was my shield. Despite Grandma Vivian's warnings, my baseline flaw was my desire for peace. I kept saying yes, because saying no caused an emotional hurricane that took weeks to clear. When Chloe announced she was getting married to Julian, the family went into overdrive. They weren't planning a modest backyard wedding. Chloe insisted on a 4-day celebration at a historic villa near Lake Como, Italy. The venue alone cost more than my annual salary. My mother called me daily, dropping hints about how expensive the flights were and how Julian's family was very high society, meaning our family needed to put on a grand show to match them. I explicitly told my mother I wouldn't fund the wedding. I told her I was saving every spare dollar for a down payment on a historic townhouse in the city that I had been eyeing for 3 years. I had a separate high-yield savings account where I deposited money every single month, watching the balance grow to exactly $65,200. It was my freedom fund. It was the physical proof of my hard work, my late nights, and my independence. My mother smiled, patted my hand, and said she understood. Chloe, however, didn't say a word to me about money for 2 months. She just smiled her signature, sharp smile whenever we met. Then came the first major warning sign that I completely missed because I was buried in a massive patent infringement case at work. I received a notification from my bank that a password reset had been requested for my online portal. I assumed it was a system glitch or a phishing attempt, so I changed my password, updated my security questions, and moved on. 3 days later, I noticed my physical mail at my apartment was arriving late, and some statements were missing altogether. I didn't think much of it until I got a call from a local notary public named Marcus Vance. No relation to me, just a strange coincidence with the last name. Marcus called my office line. He sounded nervous. He asked if I had recently authorized a power of attorney document giving my sister, Chloe Vance, full access to my financial assets due to an impending medical procedure. My blood turned to ice. I told him absolutely not. Marcus explained that Chloe had come into his office with a woman who claimed to be me, carrying a fake driver's license with my details, but a different photo. Marcus had felt something was off because the woman couldn't answer basic questions about my employer, so he turned them away and looked up my professional credentials online to find my direct office number. I thanked Marcus, my hands shaking as I hung up the phone. I immediately checked my bank account online. The $65,200 was still there. I breathed a sigh of relief, thinking I had caught the threat in time. I called Chloe immediately, my voice trembling with fury. She answered on the second ring, the sound of upbeat lounge music playing in the background. When I demanded to know why she was trying to forge a power of attorney, her voice didn't even waver. She laughed, that light, airy sound that always made me feel like I was the insane one. "Oh, Claire, don't be so dramatic," she said smoothly. "I was just checking what options we had for the family travel expenses. Mom said you wanted to help. You're paying, right? You owe us." There it was again. The absolute conviction that my labor belonged to her. I told her if she ever tried to touch my accounts again, I would file a formal police report. She laughed again and hung up. I spent the next day implementing what I thought were foolproof security measures. I called my bank, flagged the account for fraud, and demanded that any withdrawal over $1,000 require in-person verification with 2 forms of government identification. The branch manager assured me the notes were added to my profile. I felt safe. I went back to work, focusing on a complex patent application for a biomedical firm. I thought my boundaries were set in stone. 2 weeks later, my mother called me to invite me to a private family dinner at an upscale Italian restaurant downtown. She said it was a small celebration for Chloe's upcoming trip to Italy to finalize the venue. I didn't want to go, but Grandma Vivian texted me, saying she would be there too, and she wanted an excuse to get out of the house. I agreed to go, purely to keep an eye on them and to ensure Grandma Vivian had a pleasant evening. The restaurant was loud, filled with the scent of roasted garlic and expensive wine. My parents, Chloe, and Julian were already seated when I arrived with Grandma Vivian. Chloe looked radiant, wearing a brand new designer dress that I knew cost at least $2,000. Julian was sipping a glass of champagne, looking smug. The dinner proceeded with artificial warmth. My mother talked endlessly about the floral arrangements and the catering options in Lake Como, while my father stared blankly at his water glass. When the main courses were cleared, Chloe wiped her mouth with a cloth napkin, reached into her leather handbag, and pulled out a crisp, white envelope. She didn't hand it to me right away. Instead, she slid it across the white tablecloth until it rested directly between my wine glass and my plate. She leaned forward, her pearl earrings catching the harsh restaurant light. "Open it, Claire," she whispered, her eyes gleaming with a terrifying sort of triumph. "It's the formal receipt for the Lake Como Villa deposit. Paid in full." I frowned, looking from her to my mother, who was suddenly very interested in her dessert fork. I opened the envelope. Inside was a confirmation receipt from the luxury resort in Italy, showing a wire transfer deposit of exactly $65,200. The source account listed on the document was my high-yield savings account. My heart stopped. My vision blurred around the edges as I looked at the numbers. The exact amount of my down payment fund had been wiped out 48 hours prior. I looked up at Chloe, my voice entirely gone. She just smiled, leaned back in her chair, and crossed her arms. "You're paying, right?" "You owe us," she repeated, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. My father looked away, while my mother reached across the table to pat my arm, her hand feeling heavy and cold. She whispered that it was for the best, that a house could wait, but Chloe's wedding was a once-in-a-lifetime event. They had bypassed my security blocks by using an old joint account from my college years that I had forgotten to formally close, an account that my mother's name was technically still attached to as a secondary holder. Chloe had convinced my mother to sign a manual transfer authorization form, moving my entire savings into that joint pool before wiring it directly to Italy. I sat perfectly still, the ambient noise of the restaurant fading into a dull roar. I didn't scream, and I didn't cry. My patent law training took over. When a client discovers their proprietary technology has been stolen by a competitor, panicking guarantees a loss. Instead, you quietly document the breach and prepare the injunction. Grandma Vivian set her teacup down with a sharp clink against the saucer, her eyes fixed on Chloe with absolute disgust. "You think you've won something, Chloe," Grandma Vivian said, her voice cutting through the table's artificial celebration like a blade. "But you've just traded your sister's love for a piece of dirt in Europe. You're a thief." Chloe rolled her eyes, telling Grandma Vivian she was living in the past and that families share wealth. "Before I tell you how I used federal intellectual property statutes and international banking disclosures to lock my sister out of her own wedding venue and freeze Julian's hidden assets, let's do a quick check. If you've ever been treated like a personal bank account by people who claim to love you, drop a comment right now. Because the paper trail I started uncovering at midnight that night proved that the $65,200 was only the surface of what they had been hiding from me." I excused myself from the table, paid for Grandma Vivian's ride home, and went straight to my apartment. I didn't sleep. I opened my laptop, pulled up my secure firm access portal, and began running a comprehensive background asset check on Julian and my sister. As a patent attorney, I have access to advanced corporate registration databases and international financial tracking tools used to verify the legitimacy of foreign patent applicants. What I discovered over the next 6 hours made my stomach turn. Julian wasn't a luxury travel consultant. He was an undischarged bankrupt individual with 3 active civil judgments against him in the state of New York for fraudulent business practices totaling over $112,000. More importantly, I found the corporate entity he had used to book the Italian villa. He had registered a shell company under the name Vance Luxury Events, using my name and my professional bar license number as the registered agent without my knowledge or consent. He had forged my digital signature on the incorporation documents to give the business a veneer of legal credibility so the Italian resort would accept their corporate wire transfers. They hadn't just stolen my money, they had entangled my professional legal standing in a fraudulent corporate structure. If that shell company defaulted or faced a tax audit in Italy, my license to practice law before the federal government would be placed under immediate review. The betrayal had officially crossed from a family dispute into an existential threat to my livelihood. My sister's signature line, "You're paying, right? You owe us," took on a malicious new meaning. They thought my fear of a public scandal would force me to stay quiet and absorb the loss. At 4 a.m., I made a quiet, definitive decision. I was going to use the exact laws I spent my life defending to dismantle their entire plan. I drafted a formal non-party subpoena and a cease and desist order based on identity theft and unauthorized corporate representation. I attached the certified notary statement from Marcus Vance regarding the previous forgery attempt, along with the digital forensic logs showing the unauthorized access to my information. The next morning, I visited Grandma Vivian. She met me at the door with a folder of her own. She handed it to me without a word. Inside were the original deeds to the family property my grandfather had left behind, a property my parents had quietly leveraged to give Chloe her initial business loans. Grandma Vivian had kept the master ledgers. "Use whatever you need, Claire," she said firmly, tapping her fountain pen against the kitchen table. "They think you're weak because you're quiet. Show them how loud your silence can be." With Grandma Vivian's documentation and my legal filings ready, I initiated the first phase of my strategy. I didn't call the police immediately. Local police would treat a joint account dispute as a civil matter, which would take months to resolve. Instead, I contacted the Compliance and Anti-Money Laundering Department of the International Intermediary Bank that handled the wire transfer to Italy. I filed a formal notice of corporate identity fraud, alerting them that the wire from Vance Luxury Events utilized a forged federal agent credential. Under international banking regulations regarding fraudulent corporate funding, a bank must immediately place a temporary hold on the destination funds while an internal investigation is conducted. I knew the Italian resort wouldn't receive the clearance notice for the final deposit. To them, the venue would appear unpaid, triggering an automatic cancellation clause within 48 hours unless an authorized corporate officer cleared the flag. I then drafted an official notification to the Italian Villa's legal counsel, written in precise contractual terms, explaining that the funds used for the deposit were subject to an active federal fraud investigation in the United States. I offered them a choice: cancel the reservation immediately and return the held funds to the source account to avoid being named as a third-party participant in an international asset concealment scheme, or risk a formal freeze by Western authorities. By the time Wednesday afternoon arrived, my traps were completely set. My family believed I was at home weeping over my lost savings, preparing to buy a cheaper apartment or take out a loan. Chloe sent me a text message containing an image of her wedding invitations, embossed with gold foil, asking if I wanted a seat near the back or if I was going to stay home and pout. I didn't reply. I simply scheduled a family meeting for Friday evening at my parents' house, telling them I had a final document I needed everyone to sign regarding the $15,000 outstanding loan. They agreed instantly, believing I was coming to hand over more financial concessions. I arrived at my parents' house at exactly 6 p.m. on Friday. The summer heat was oppressive, and the living room smelled faintly of the lavender air freshener my mother always used to mask the dampness in the old baseboards. My parents were sitting on the floral sofa, while Chloe and Julian lounged on the matching love seat, looking like they had already stepped onto the shores of Lake Como. Julian had a sleek leather folder open on his lap, and Chloe was scrolling through her phone, not even looking up when the front door closed behind me. Grandma Vivian was already there, sitting straight-backed in the single armchair by the window. She had her vintage leather handbag resting firmly across her lap, and her silver fountain pen was tucked neatly into her front pocket. She caught my eye and gave me a single, slow nod. The room felt like a courtroom waiting for the judge to sit down. "Thanks for coming, Claire," my mother said, her voice dripping with artificial warmth. "We really appreciate you being mature about this. Family has to support each other's milestones. Now, what's this paper your father needs to sign?" I didn't sit down. I stood at the edge of the dining table, unzipped my briefcase, and pulled out a stack of neat, bound legal documents. I laid them out in 3 separate piles, flat against the polished wood. "This isn't about father's loan," I said calmly. My voice was completely flat, completely devoid of the anger they expected. Chloe sighed heavily, looking up from her screen. "Oh my God, Claire. If you're going to make a scene about the deposit again, just save it. The money is already in Italy. The venue is locked in. You're paying, right? You owe us. It's done." "The money isn't in Italy, Chloe," I replied, looking directly at her. "The wire transfer was flagged 48 hours ago by the Compliance Department of Interbank New York for international corporate identity fraud. The funds are currently sitting in a federal holding escrow account at the branch downtown." Julian's posture changed instantly. He froze, his hand stopping midair as he went to close his leather folder. "What are you talking about? That was a private transfer." "It was a wire transfer initiated by an unauthorized corporate entity named Vance Luxury Events," I said, sliding the first set of documents toward him. "An entity that you registered using my federal patent attorney bar identification number as your registered agent. You forged my electronic signature to bypass international business verification laws." My mother looked confused, looking between Julian and me. "Claire, stop using that lawyer talk. Julian is a travel consultant. He helped us move the money. Julian is an undischarged bankrupt with 3 active civil fraud judgments against him totaling $112,000, I said, my voice cutting through the room like a scalpel. And as of 9 a.m. yesterday morning, I filed a formal corporate identity theft injunction with the federal district court. Because your little shell company used a federal attorney's credentials to execute a fraudulent transaction, the bank didn't just freeze the $65,200. They froze the entire corporate clearing account attached to Vance Luxury Events. Chloe stood up, her face flushing a deep, angry crimson. You didn't. You're lying. You wouldn't ruin my wedding over a stupid down payment. I didn't ruin your wedding, Chloe. You did, the moment you put my career in jeopardy to pay for a villa you couldn't afford, I said. The Italian resort received my cease and desist order yesterday. Because the final funding didn't clear their fraud screening, they executed the automatic cancellation clause in your contract at noon today. Your reservation at Lake Como no longer exists. The room fell into an absolute, suffocating silence. My father sat back against the sofa, his mouth slightly open, staring at the papers on the table. My mother looked like she had been slapped, her hand flying to her chest. Julian's face drained of color. He leaned forward, his voice dropping its slick, charming tone and turning sharp and venomous. You think you're so smart, don't you? You just ruined a multi-million-dollar family connection. My family will sue you for everything you have. Your family can't even pay your rent, Julian. Grandma Vivian's voice rang out from the corner. She tapped her fountain pen against her handbag. I looked into your family history myself. Your father's luxury consulting firm went into liquidation 3 years ago. You're all hot air and stolen coats. Chloe turned on our parents, her voice rising to a shriek. Do something. Dad. Mom. She stole my deposit back. She's destroying my life. My mother looked at me, her eyes filled with a desperate, furious panic. Claire. How could you do this to your sister? Real daughters don't keep receipts. You're supposed to protect this family. Real families don't steal a lifetime of savings from the daughter who actually works, I said softly, looking her dead in the eye. And real daughters absolutely keep receipts when their own blood treats them like a target. I pointed to the second pile of documents on the table. Those are the certified bank logs showing every single transfer from my college joint account over the last 5 years, signed by you, Mom, and routed directly to Chloe's personal accounts. And the third pile is a formal demand letter for the immediate repayment of the $15,000 loan I took over for Father, along with a revocation of my financial power of attorney for both of your medical directives. Julian stood up, grabbing Chloe's arm. We're leaving. This is insane. She can't enforce any of this. If you walk out that door, Julian, the federal marshal who received my identity theft filing this morning will be waiting at your registered apartment address with a formal summons, I said, not moving an inch. The bank has already agreed to return the $65,200 to my private account once the fraud affidavit is signed tonight. If you sign these restructuring documents right now, agreeing to dissolve the shell company and indemnify me from all corporate liabilities, I will waive the civil damages. If you don't, I'm filing the criminal complaint before the courthouse closes at 8 p.m. Julian looked down at the documents, his fingers trembling. He knew exactly what a federal identity theft charge would do to his existing probation terms. Without saying a single word to Chloe, he reached across the table, grabbed my pen, and scribbled his signature on the lines I pointed to. Chloe watched him, her eyes wide with horror as she realized her high society fiancé was signing away her dream wedding just to save his own skin. Julian? What are you doing? Stop. He didn't look at her. He finished signing, dropped the pen onto the table, and walked straight out the front door, leaving the house in a deafening silence. The heavy wooden front door clicked shut behind Julian, leaving an echoing emptiness in the hallway. Chloe stood frozen for 3 seconds, staring at the empty space her fiancé had just been standing. Then, she slowly turned her head back toward the dining table, her eyes wide, wild, and completely out of options. The absolute certainty that had defined her entire life, the belief that the world would always bend to her whims, shattered right in front of us. He left, she whispered, her voice cracking as the reality of the situation finally settled into her bones. You scared him away. You ruined everything, Claire. I have no venue, no money, and now I have no wedding. You never had the money, Chloe, I said, my voice remaining as level and calm as if I were reading a patent citation in a quiet office. You had my money. There's a big difference. My mother burst into heavy, dramatic tears, burying her face in her hands. She kept sobbing that the family name was ruined, that she would never be able to look her friends in the eye after telling everyone about the Grand Lake Como celebration. My father just sat there, his head in his hands, staring down at his worn leather shoes. For the first time in my life, nobody was yelling at me to fix it. Nobody was telling me to write another check to patch over the cracks. The immediate consequences of that evening rolled out over the next few weeks with mathematical precision. Interbank New York finalized their internal fraud investigation within 48 hours, completely clearing my name of any association with Julian's fraudulent shell company. The $65,200 was legally restored to my high-yield savings account, plus the accrued interest. 3 days later, I used those exact funds to put down a firm, non-refundable deposit on the historic townhouse I had been eyeing for years. The keys were in my hand by the end of the month. Chloe's life, however, entered a massive financial downward spiral. Once Julian realized the Vance family wasn't a bottomless pit of corporate wealth, he vanished entirely, leaving Chloe with a $12,000 credit card bill for a collection of designer wedding dresses and custom luggage she couldn't return. Without my monthly $450 injections to cover her old interior design debts, the bank moved forward with collection notices against my father, forcing my parents to downsize their home and move into a small, one-bedroom managed apartment. Chloe had to take a real, hourly wage job working the front desk at a local gym just to pay her share of the rent. Grandma Vivian came over to my new townhouse the day I finished moving in. She walked through the empty, sunlit rooms, her low heels clicking softly against the dark hardwood floors. She stopped by the large bay window, looking out over the city, pulled her silver fountain pen from her pocket, and set it gently on my new kitchen counter. "You didn't just build a house, Claire," she said, looking back at me with a rare, bright smile. "You built a boundary. They spent 30 years trying to teach you that your only value was what they could take from you. You proved to them that your mind belongs entirely to you." Looking back on everything, I realized a universal truth about toxic family dynamics. The people who accuse you of being cold for setting boundaries are almost always the ones who are benefiting from you having none. Peace isn't the absence of conflict, it's the presence of self-respect. I had to lose the family I thought I had to finally protect the life I had actually earned. So, let me ask you a question. If your own sister forged your name and wiped out your entire life savings for a luxury wedding, would you file the fraud charges to get your money back, or would you stay quiet to keep the family peace? Tell me your thoughts in the comments below. And if this story reminded you that true family is built on respect, not exploitation, make sure to hit that subscribe button. I'll see you in the next one.